So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, happy United Nations Day. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. And I want to thank the United Nations Association for bringing us together, albeit virtually. The UN is turning 75 this year, and it has been my great privilege to be part of it for the past 40 of them. What I would like to do today is to reflect with you a bit on its past, to see how we arrived at this present moment, and explore what that teaches us about where we need to go next. Let me start with the present. I think we're all painfully aware that 2020, rather than being a year of proud celebration for the UN, has put it and the world at large to an existential test. Words such as unprecedented and historic feature in almost every other sentence we hear or read. And not without reason, of course. COVID-19 has indeed revealed dramatic failures of our societies, long ignored environmental crisis, economic inequality, political ineptitude, social divides. All of this and more has been brought into painful focus by the global pandemic. And yet, despite all this, and perhaps counterintuitively for some, I would like to sound a counter note of optimism. Not naive feel-goodery or tone-deaf hopefulness, but optimism that is rooted in experience and based on fact. The experience of the past 7.5 decades and the fact of the extraordinary progress they brought humanity. Before the pandemic struck, I often asked people to imagine the following. If you could choose any moment in history in which to be born, and you did not know whether you were going to be male or female, which country you were going to be from, or what your status was, which time would you choose? I think that you would have had a hard time justifying choosing anything other than the present, in spite of the many headlines of our time. Because if you choose today, you would be less likely to be living in poverty, less likely to be illiterate, less likely to confront intolerance and oppression, and less likely to be killed in war than at any time in human history. All of this and much more has happened over the course of just a few decades. And all that progress is real, it has been broad, and it has been deep, and it all happened in what, by the standards of human history, was nothing more than the blink of an eye. The last 75 years have brought a level of peace, rights, and well-being for humanity that quite simply has never been seen before. And it is no accident that this progress we have achieved since 1945 coincided with the establishment of a multilateral structure with the United Nations at its heart. There is a direct correlation here. So let's unpack it by going back a bit in time. The First World War marked a watershed in many ways, and one of them was that the bankruptcy of the old idea that balance of power politics could ever be a guarantor of peace. Clearly, an alternative international order was needed, and in this vacuum emerged the idea of multilateralism, finding expression in the establishment of the League of Nations here in Geneva. To be sure, the inability of the League to prevent a Second World War has long made it a byword for failure, a sort of graveyard of hopes, if you wish. Today, however, that simplistic and I think unfair view is giving way to the recognition that the League, despite its constraints and contradictions, nurtured the nucleus of a system that has since proven to be remarkably successful. For when the United Nations was created out of the remnants of the League in 1945, the multilateral order finally caught on. The audacity of the ideas that underpin the multilateral structure and architecture remains astounding to this day. To replace violence with the rule of law as a basis for global governance, to give each state, whether rich or poor, large or small, one vote, and finally to declare human rights unconditional and universal. Of course, there were many places in which reality made a mockery of this ideal, of these ideals, where tyrants still ruled, where colonial regimes refused to give way to the forces of freedom, but they soon found themselves on the defensive. And of course, the Cold War, and with it the terrible nuclear threat, cast a long shadow. But not only did we avoid open confrontation between the superpowers, and with it a Third World War, war itself came to be considered illegal, an idea that would have seemed simply absurd to earlier generations. And with these political changes came sweeping economic changes, leading to the incredible gains in global wealth, in life expectancy and opportunity that I mentioned earlier. And the connection is direct and tangible. You can see it in measures, small and large. Let me just mention 3 very practical and tangible examples out of thousands. You can see it in conflicts prevented or diffused across the world by the quiet workings of the UN mediation, in places as different as El Salvador, Sierra Leone, or Nepal. You can see it in deadly diseases eliminated by actions led by the World Health Organization, like the vaccination programs that eliminated smallpox. You can see that even in the dialing codes you use to call colleagues and family abroad, a system developed by the International Telecommunication Union here in Geneva. All of these is multilateralism in practice. And all of this continues today, day in and day out. For example, right now, the United Nations assists and protects 82.5 million people fleeing war, famine, and persecution. It supplies vaccines to 50% of the world's children, helping save 3 million lives a year. It keeps peace with 95,000 peacekeepers in 13 peacekeeping operations around the world. It protects and promotes human rights globally and through 80 treaties and declarations. It coordinates a 28 billion program for the humanitarian needs of 109 million people. It uses diplomacy to prevent conflict and assists some 50 countries a year with their elections. It helps over 2 million women a month overcome pregnancy and childbirth complications. In short, and some of you will have heard me say that in the past, there is not a single person on this planet that isn't touched every single day by something the United Nations has done, has come up with, has thought up, invented, whatever you care to mention. Every single one of us is affected positively in any 24-hour period. And yet, for all the peace and prosperity underwritten by the international structures put in place since 1945, today we find ourselves once again engulfed in crisis, even before COVID-19 brought the world to its knees. So what happened? I think that sometimes over the past decades, a complacency set in, a naive belief, as it turned out, that things would just invariably get better, that despite some backsliding here and there, forward movement was inexorable and large-scale conflict a thing of the past. It was through this lens that many just assumed that technological progress and globalization would produce benefits that ultimately would reach all. This complacency bred in action, and the twin forces of globalization and technological disruption, left unchecked, ultimately triggered the global backlash we are confronting today. And so today we hear troubling echoes of the past, from eroding trust in the democratic order to the outrage at rampant inequality. But the one I'd like to explore a bit further has to do with the breakdown of global cooperation, with the return of international politics as a zero-sum competition, with the weakening of international solidarity, a sad and worrying reality reinforced by the global mismanagement of the pandemic and its economic and financial fallout that we all live in and suffer from today. We no longer live in a bipolar or unipolar world. Our world is increasingly becoming multipolar, and we are in a chaotic transition phase. The relationship between the 3 most important powers today, the United States, China, and Russia, has rarely been as dysfunctional as it is today. Medium-sized powers are increasingly acting autonomously from the big powers. It is impossible to look at Syria, for example, and not recognize the role of the regional powers. The same is true for other conflicts around the world. Power relations are becoming unclear, with a fragmentation of actions, with impunity and unpredictability prevailing, and with national and isolationist agendas superseding mutual trust and international cooperation. The point is that we've been there before, and that should worry us. Because multipolarity without strong and accepted multilateral instruments, just as we saw in Europe in the wake of the First World War, might be a factor of some equilibrium, but it certainly is not a factor of peace. It is inherently unstable, volatile, and dangerous. So that is another echo of the past that we hear today. Yet, to say that the world is poised on the brink of another 1914, as some suggest, I think is too simple. International relations work differently today, and so does politics. One obvious difference is the diffusion of power. Power that used to be firmly in the hands of the state has metamorphosed into something much more diffuse, whether it's non-state actors challenging the state's monopoly of violence, or whether it is private corporations evading effective regulation by any one state. Power in international relations today is altogether a more complex, messy affair. Whereas in the past, international relations were centralized, with core and periphery, with top-down commands and control, today we live in an age of entanglement. Global politics has been reconfigured. The traditional chessboard of interstate diplomacy may still exist, but it is joined by a new web of networks made up of governments, companies, NGOs, terrorist groups, philanthropists, and countless others, all wielding influence and cooperating or clashing at various points in time. And in response to all this, multilateralism is changing too. By necessity, it has to become more integrated, more networked, more inclusive. And the upshot of that is that everyone forms part of the networks that will define the very multilateral global governance will evolve. And these intricate connections are mirrored by the major existential challenges we face, which are more and more interlinked, more and more interfering with each other, whether it's the looming climate calamity, the collapse of biodiversity, the fever pitch of geopolitical tensions, or indeed a global pandemic. Indeed, the honest assessment is that none of these challenges emerged in a vacuum. They are not unrelated to the spoils we enjoyed over the past 75 years. And put bluntly, the prosperity we have enjoyed these past decades has come at a steep price. Let's take stock. We are facing a crisis of trust. Challenges threaten to overwhelm us just as interests fragment, power is diffuse, and the only constant is disruptive change. So where do we go from here? How do we react? I think that those are, in the broader sense, the questions that we all have to tackle today. And the answer has everything to do with multilateralism in general and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in particular. Because even now, as we see entire regions set back years in a matter of a few months by the pandemic, as millions of people may be pushed into extreme poverty, I am convinced that the only credible path forward is multilateral. If anything, COVID-19 reinforces the imperative need for a renewed and more effective multilateralism. This crisis we're living right now is not a failure of the notion of multilateralism. The temporary failure of our governance systems we are living right now lies in the absence of multilateral actions defined by an increase in nationalistic, inward-looking, defensive postures. The operative word here, I think, is temporary, because we simply have no choice but to revert to international cooperation and solidarity if we want to ensure a healthy future for our planet. Today, we have a surplus of multilateral challenges and a deficit of multilateral solutions. As we look ahead to building forward better, to coming out of this stronger, we do well to remember the lessons of the past. Not everything has to be reinvented. Some of it has to be reinforced and reapplied. Because I think this is my most important point. We have the tools, resources, and instruments we need to overcome the current existential challenges, whether in health, climate, development, corruption, armaments, finance, etc. We just need to strengthen our collective will. With the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, we have an enduring and unifying vision, a framework to guide our decisions and actions as we look to respond and recover, our global roadmap, in other words. And from the awakening that this crisis we are living in right now is triggering, we have a chance, and indeed the responsibility, to create an inclusive network, more collaborative and effective multilateralism in which everyone can and must play an active part. The difference between the SDGs slipping out of reach or becoming a tangible and impactful reality, that difference is you. It's all of us. And it's associations like yours who, by living the values and objectives of the United Nations every day, by staying actively engaged, by spreading the word, by taking responsibility, by connecting across geographies, are helping to make a crucial difference. And Switzerland in particular has a role to play in ensuring our future is multilateral. We may have waited until 2002 to join the organization, but Switzerland's attachment to multilateralism goes back much, much further and is much deeper. I'm speaking to you from international Geneva, the capital of peace, of humanitarian action and human rights, the operational heart of the multilateral system for over 100 years and counting, a city whose unique ecosystem spans over 100 international organizations, some 700 NGOs, representatives of 180 states, a large and vibrant private sector, and world-class academic institutions. Geneva is the place where every day new partnerships are formed and innovative solutions are developed to improve the lives of people the world over. For a multilateralist like myself, there really was little question where I would live even after leaving the UN. It was always going to be Switzerland, and it was always going to be Geneva. Where else, after all, would I have as many opportunities to keep involved and keep contributing towards our collective efforts? Remember what we humans have achieved over the past 75 years. We know what the problems are. We know what it takes to solve them. And we increasingly realize that it can only be done through collective action. Together, and only together, can we turn this around and ensure that we leave no one behind. And I'm encouraged and very grateful that we can count you on the side of all of us who strive to make our world a better and more sustainable place for our children. Thank you again for your kind invitation, and my very best wishes to all of you for a prosperous and healthy future. Thank you.